Many years ago, I was doing this study in an ecclesia, and after this particular study, a sister came up to me and said, "You've destroyed my vision of the kingdom." So I gently said to her, "Perhaps you should take off your rose-coloured glasses and actually read what's there." So that's a warning, because, you know, we're going to talk about the spilling of blood. We're going to talk about sacrifice in the kingdom. And this is one reason why I think some people shy away from it. And we've got people saying there will be no sacrifice in the kingdom, that there won't even be a temple. So we need to just read what's there. So you're going to hear from me what the scripture says, and it won't be rose-coloured glasses. It'll be actually what's written. And that's what we've got to accept. Now, I want to start with an important principle. It's the principle of Psalm 50, verse 23. And those of you who are familiar with this psalm will know it's an absolutely majestic Armageddon psalm. It's a psalm that deals with the time that is shortly coming when the kingdom will be established. And the very last verse of that psalm says this: "Whoso offereth praise glorifieth me." And you'll notice that that word offereth there is the Hebrew word zabak. That's the word used throughout the Old Testament for sacrifice. So it's talking about offering sacrifice. And you know, when you praise your God, brothers and sisters, you have to give time to that. You have to find a place and you have to give time to that. That's a sacrifice. You're stepping aside from your normal everyday activities to spend time to give praise and glory and honour to your God. That's a sacrifice. And that's how he sees it. He sees people who do that. He says, "Whoso offereth praise glorifieth me." And as you can see, that word glorify there is kabad in the Hebrew. It means to make heavy or weighty, to make honourable, to honour, to glorify. That's what you're doing. You're offering this sacrifice to honour your God. Then he says this: "And to him that ordereth his conversation aright will I show the salvation of God." And that word conversation there is the Hebrew word derek. And derek means a way, a well-trodden road, can mean a journey, therefore, on that road, or direction in life, a course of life, used in the figurative sense. So this is talking about the way you order your life. Now, those who offer sacrifice by praising their God are usually those who have got their life in order. They have got their direction in life settled, because that's the course they've chosen. That's the important principle in relation to sacrifice. It's about your involvement in it. Now, let me just address this problem that we have nowadays, unfortunately, of sacrifice in the kingdom. Now, I'm not going to quote to you all of the passages, but the first two of them, I want you to join me in the context. It's very important when you're dealing with a subject like this. It becomes sensitive in our community. It's very important you establish the context of the quotations you're making. And the first of those is in Jeremiah chapter 33. That's where I'm going to go. I want you to see the context here, because all you've got on the screen, you see this is verses 14 to 18. All you have on the screen is just one little selection from that bracket of verses in Jeremiah 33. It's critical to establish what the time period is. When is this happening? Because the section I've quoted is, "Neither shall the priests, the Levites, want a man before me to offer burnt offerings and to do sacrifice continually." So what era does this belong to? Is it the past? Is it, as some have suggested, the time of Joshua and Zerubbabel when they built the second temple? I think that the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel are about that, ridiculously. Is it that? Let's establish exactly what your context is. Jeremiah chapter 33, and I'm going to read from verse 14. And it says this: "Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that I will perform that good thing which I have promised unto the house of Israel and to the house of Judah." Now, straight away, you know that you're dealing with the redemption of both those nations, Judah and Israel. Israel's been scattered. They were scattered in 722 BC. They're going to be gathered by Elijah in the second Exodus. So we know this is about the redemption of both the houses of Israel. It's got to be future. Verse 15, "In those days and at that time will I cause the branch of righteousness to grow up unto David, and he shall execute judgment and righteousness in the land. In those days shall Judah be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. So have either of those things happened? Has Jerusalem been made peaceful? Has the people of Judah, it's always a reference, by the way, in prophecy to the Jews in the land at the time of the return of Christ, okay? Have they been redeemed? Of course they haven't. This is future. It's about the work of Christ. It goes on to say that they will say, Yahweh, our righteousness. Well, they're not doing that today. Then look at verse 17. For thus saith Yahweh, David shall never want a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel. Is Christ on the throne of David yet? Well, of course he isn't. That's tomorrow, isn't it? So we know the context of these verses. It's the future, which is why when you come to verse 18, you read this. Neither shall the priests, the Levites, want a man before me to offer burnt offerings and to kindle meal offerings and to do sacrifice continually. It's about sacrifice in the kingdom age, at the time when Judah and Israel are redeemed. Now, that's the first of the references. The second one is in Isaiah 56. We're not too far away from Isaiah 56. If that one wasn't clear enough, this one will be. Isaiah 56, verses 6 and 7. Now, this is the chapter that deals with Gentile redemption. It says here in verse 6, also the sons of the stranger that join themselves to Yahweh to serve him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants, every one that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it and taketh hold of my covenant. And we're in this category, aren't we? So there were people like that back in the days of Isaiah who wanted to join themselves to Israel. We've done the same thing, and we have tried to be Yahweh's servants. Verse 7, even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar. For mine house should be called an house of prayer for all peoples. Do I need to say anything about the timing of that prophecy and when it will be fulfilled? It is so obviously future, isn't it? So we know that we, yes, immortals, if we're there, we will offer sacrifices in the kingdom. So we need to get that straight, brothers and sisters, because it's being questioned, seriously questioned in some of our magazines. Yeah, and we need to get that straight. Let's just take a few more. And there are hundreds of these, by the way. Let's take a few more. I'm not going to turn these up for the sake of time. Psalm 51, verses 18 and 19. David, this is the psalm he wrote about his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, remember? He had a need. He had a need to make sacrifice, but under the law of Moses, there was no sacrifice for murder and for adultery. You got stoned, all right? So he couldn't turn to the law, could he? He had to turn to God's grace. And he says this at the end of that psalm. Then, and when you look at the context, he's talking about the future. He's talking about the kingdom. Then shalt thou be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offerings, etc. So there will be sacrifice in the kingdom. Malachi 3, 1-4. Then shall the offering of Judah be pleasant unto Yahweh as in the days of old. Just read Malachi. The problem they had, of course, was they were offering to Yahweh offerings that were defiled and corrupt, unclean. So he's talking about what they used to do. They used to offer sacrifice. And so it will happen again in the kingdom age. And Isaiah 60, verse 1 and verse 7. You can't mistake this. We know the context of Isaiah 60. It's about the future. And it says this, all the flocks of Kedar, these are the Arab peoples, shall come up with acceptance on mine altar. So there will be an altar and there will be sacrifices made on that altar. And you and I, brothers and sisters, are going to make those sacrifices. And so will our Lord Jesus Christ, as we're going to see in our studies today. And in our exhortation, as I said yesterday, we're going to see that you and I, through that 1,000-year period, will have an opportunity to operate as one of his priests. Yes, one of his priests. I'll show that to you in the exhortation this morning from Ezekiel chapter 45. So I hope that lays that matter to rest, at least in the minds of some, because, as I said, this matter is being questioned. Now, we read this morning from Ezekiel chapter 45. So let's have a look at portions of this chapter, because one of the other charges that is made against sacrifice in the kingdom is that it's a reversion to the law of Moses. Well, that's simply not true, as you're going to see. Yes, the law of Moses is going to be, in some ways, parts of it brought into, in terms of rituals, parts of it, as you're going to see, will be brought into the services of the future. But let's just be clear about this. The principles of the law of Moses, leave aside the rituals for the time being, the principles of the law of Moses became the principles of the law of Christ. They don't change. God's principles that Paul says in Romans 7 were holy, just and true, don't change. Like Malachi 3, Yahweh says, I am Yahweh. I change not. So the principles of the law were then the law of Christ. We read the commandments of Christ. They're the same principles as the law. Are they going to change in the kingdom? Of course not. What will change is those things that have to do with the rituals. And that's what we're going to find here in Ezekiel 45. Yes, there are certain things adopted from the law, but it's not a reversion. It's not a renewal of the law of Moses. That's gone. That's another charge that's made, and we need to get that one right as well. Now, let's have a look then at Ezekiel 45, verses 18 to 20. And this was read for us. And what we have here in that little section is the rituals, the sacrifices that will be made at the turn of the year, the new year. And we're going to read, when I can get there, to Ezekiel 45, verse 18. It says this, Thus saith Adonai Yahweh, in the first month, in the first day of the month, thou shalt take a young bullock without blemish and cleanse the sanctuary. It goes on to talk in verse 19 about what the priest shall do. The priest shall take of the blood of the sin offering and put it upon the posts of the house and upon the four corners of the settle of the altar and upon the posts of the gate of the inner court. Now, who do you think might be the priest here? Well, it could be one of you. Because if you just cast your eyes back to the end of chapter 40, let's just go back and have a look at the, no, it's not 40, that's 43. Have a look at the end of chapter 43. I'm not going to read all of this, but I want you to notice from verse 19, the language is used in Ezekiel 43, verse 19. And thou shalt give to the priests the Levites that be of the seed of Zadok, so you know who they are. This is the immortal priesthood, which approach unto me to minister unto me, saith Adonai Yahweh, a young bullock for a sin offering. I want you to notice the next verse. It begins with the word thou. Now, this is one of the values of the King James Version, by the way, brothers and sisters. Invariably, when you have the T words, thee and thou, it's always singular. When you have the Y words, ye, you, your, invariably, it's not perfect, but invariably, it's always plural. I find that quite useful because this is addressing Ezekiel himself personally. So have a look at the way these verses start. At the end of verse 20, you've got thou shalt cleanse and purge it. Verse 21, thou shalt take the bullock. Verse 22, on the second day, thou shalt offer a kid. Verse 23, when thou hast made an end of cleansing, thou shalt offer. Verse 24, and so it goes on. It's not a bad idea to highlight that in your Bible because it's telling, Ezekiel's being told, Ezekiel, you are going to make these offerings. Now, he's there as a representative of you and me, of the bride of Christ. You, Ezekiel, are going to make these offerings. So you and I are going to be involved in it. We have to get used to the idea. You know, if you're like me, you see blood, you faint. I did that once. Woke up and the dog's licking my face. I cut my thumb on a sardine can. And I fainted at the sight of blood. And it was a dog licking my face, you know. So I don't like blood. I don't think many like shedding of blood, do they? But you've got to get used to the idea. This is why that sister said to me, you've destroyed my vision of the kingdom. Well, hang on. This is the facts. I'm presenting to you what the scripture says. We've got to get used to the idea because you're going to do it. Now, you're not going to have the same problem when you're immortal as you might have when you are like we are now, mortal creatures of the dust. Not quite the same problem. However, there will be mortals that have to do this as well. They're going to have to get used to the idea. So when you read on in Ezekiel 45, I don't think we read verse 20, did we? It says, and so thou shalt do the seventh day. You notice the word day is actually not there. It's in italics. And cross it out. So shalt thou do the seventh month, it should be, for everyone that erreth. So what we have here is you've got a bullock for a sin offering that's offered on the first day of Abib, which is the beginning of Israel's religious year. And you have a bullock offered on the first day of Tishrei, the seventh month, which is the beginning of their civil year. So the Jews start their year at the seventh month of their year. Abib, of course, is what Yahweh introduced as their year. When they came out of Egypt, he said, this is the month, it's going to be the first month, Abib. So there's two offerings made in the year because there's both a religious year and a civil year. So you see then, we've got a bullock for a sin offering. What do they normally offer for a sin offering? Yeah, you know. So it's a bullock. See, so it's not an exact copy of the law. You offered a bullock under the law for a burnt offering, but here it's a sin offering. So you've got rituals, but they're not an exact copy of the law of Moses. Now you've got the Passover then referred to in verses 21 to 24. Now I'm not going to read all of that, but I am going to highlight something in that section. I want you to see with me verse 22, because it says this, and upon that day shall the prince prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bullock for a sin offering. So Christ is going to prepare a sacrifice, but it's not a lamb. Why wouldn't it be a lamb? Well, he's the lamb, isn't he? He's the lamb that was offered from the foundation of the world. So it's not a lamb. It's a bullock for a sin offering. So that's another thing. It's not a confirmation of what happened under the law of Moses. It's different, but there's still sacrifice. So you've got this idea. Let me just run down the dot points there under that heading, Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. One bullock for a sin offering on the day of Passover. The prince offers for himself and the people. 7 bullocks and 7 rams as burnt offering for each day of the feast, and 1 kid of the goats as a sin offering each day. And of course, there are meal offerings always involved. Meal offerings, of course, were an adjunct to both burnt and peace offerings under the law. Meal offering was an ephah for each bullock and ram, and a hin of oil with each ephah. So there's the details, but they're not exactly from the law of Moses. They're quite different. Let's move on then to the third thing that is here in verse 25. The third thing that is here is the Feast of Tabernacles. Great time, by the way, to go to the land of Israel. If you want to go to Israel, go in October, the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. It's the best time of the year to go there. So we've got here in verse 25, in the 7th month, in the 15th day of the month, shall he do the like in the feast of the 7 days, according to the sin offering, according to the burnt offering, and according to the meal offering, and according to the oil. So burnt, sin, and meal offerings, as for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, are applied also at the Feast of Tabernacles. Again, it's not exactly as is prescribed under the law of Moses. Now, I hope that that has achieved one thing for us, brothers and sisters. We've achieved, I hope, that there will be sacrifice, that Christ himself is going to make sacrifices, and that it's not an exact copy of the law of Moses. If we've achieved those 3 things, then we've made some good progress and we can carry on. Because what I want to take you into now is of some very important words here in Ezekiel chapter 45. And I would really recommend that you highlight these words in your Bible. Have a look with me at verse 15. I'm not going to read the whole verse. I just want the last 2 lines. And we're going to have a look at the last 2 lines of verse 17. And you'll see the phrase that I'm going to emphasize. It says at the last 2 lines of verse 15, to make reconciliation for them, saith Adonai Yahweh. That little phrase, make reconciliation, is what I have highlighted in my Bible. It's repeated in verse 17, last 2 lines. To make reconciliation for the house of Israel. And we're going to go into this in a moment. What does that mean? We're talking here about animal sacrifices. How can they make reconciliation for the people who offer them? Surely the sacrifice of Christ has been made. Surely the testimony in Hebrews 10 is that there's only one sacrifice for sins. How do you reconcile that? Well, we need to reconcile it, and we are going to do exactly that. And we're going to make a point about that, which is going to be important for what we're going to do in an hour's time, brothers and sisters, when we come to partake of bread and wine. Brother Sully says this about this matter of sacrifice. Type, anti-type, and memorial. That's what he writes on pages 58, 59 of the Temple of Ezekiel's prophecy. Since the above premises clearly indicate that animal sacrifices will be restored, how are we to understand their reinstitution in view of the testimony respecting him who hath offered one sacrifice for sins forever? Hebrews 10, verse 12. The obvious inference is that as under the Mosaic law, animal sacrifices pointed forward to the sacrificial lamb of God's providing, so in the age to come, animal sacrifices will point backward to that same provision for taking away sin. As in the former case, animal sacrifices could never in themselves take away sin, so also in the latter. Now, this is going to help us to reconcile that little phrase, make reconciliation. Now, as I said, we're going to come in a moment, we're going to come to this matter of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 12. Let's just then ask this question. Why sacrifice in the kingdom age? It's going to help us understand what we've just been talking about. Well, the Abrahamic covenant was typically confirmed by sacrifice of animals. Genesis 15, 5 to 10, 17 to 18. Today, the memorials of bread and wine do show the Lord's death till he come. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 24 to 26. We read this almost every Sunday, at least in Australia. Not sure about here, but we read this almost every Sunday at the memorial meeting. And like a lot of passages that are read frequently, it's not always well understood. Isn't that true? You read things over and over again, it's almost hidden from you. What do you think Paul means when he says you do show forth the death of Christ when you partake of bread and wine? You know what that word means in the Greek? To show forth means to publicly exhibit. Are you in the public when you're partaking of bread and wine? No. You're locked away inside this room. What's he talking about? That you publicly exhibit the death of Christ. Well, what he's saying, brothers and sisters, is that we should relive it when we partake of bread and wine. So it's like a public exhibition, which is why, and it's taken me a long time to get to this point, because I didn't understand it. We should, brothers and sisters, before we partake of the bread, before I put that bread in my mouth, I think about a man hanging in agony on the cross until I get a shiver down my spine and the few hairs on the back of my head stand up. Then I take it. Then I'm involved. Then I feel it. That's what Paul means. And the Corinthians were coming to the meetings for a feast. Bread and wine, who cares? All right, who cares, really? They treat it with disdain, which is why he uses that word in the King James, which is unfortunate in many ways. He says, he that eateth and drinketh unworthily. He doesn't mean you're unworthy morally. He means you disrespect it. You don't treat it with the respect that it's due. That's what he means. That's what the Corinthians were doing. So you need to relive it. Because every sacrifice made in the kingdom age for 1,000 years will be for that purpose. To publicly exhibit what it was like for Christ to hang on a tree, to have blood pouring out of his hands and feet, in agony for 6 hours. When the throat of that animal was cut and it goes, The vision you get is of that man hanging on a tree. It takes you back to that awful time. You feel it. That's what it's about. You publicly exhibit it. That's why there's going to be a sacrifice in the kingdom. Now, I hope that that's helpful and not damaging in any way. Because if you're like me, it took me 45 years to get to that point. I didn't understand it. Yet I was hearing it every single Sunday. You publicly exhibit the death of Christ. Hang on the tree with him, brothers and sisters. Hang on that tree until you feel it. And you'll go out of that meeting a lot better, in a lot better state of mind than you might otherwise. That's the principle I see in this. The shedding of animal blood in future will commemorate the sacrifice of Christ and bring its principles into clear focus. That's why you've got that phrase there in verse 15, to make reconciliation. Verse 17, to make reconciliation. You're reliving the sacrifice of Christ every time an animal is sacrificed. As I said, this is proven by that statement. The animal sacrifices make reconciliation for the people. There is only one mediator between God and men, and that is Christ. 1 Timothy 2, verses 5 and 6 are very clear about that. And only one sacrifice for sins. Hebrews 10 couldn't be clearer about that, 12 and 14 of that chapter. They're very clear that Christ's sacrifice is the only sacrifice that can produce the forgiveness of sins and the reconciliation of man to God. That's why every sacrifice will be a reliving of the actual sacrifice of Christ. But why the shedding of blood, do you think? Is that necessary? You know, if I was there as a Moor, I might faint again. Why the shedding of blood? Well, there are reasons. Death is greatly curtailed in the kingdom age, as we saw yesterday from Isaiah 65. A man dying aged 100 will be considered a child in the scheme of things. So they're going to live for hundreds of years. And there won't be the problems that we experience today. You're not going to be eating processed foods from your local supermarket. You're going to be eating the fruits of the field that Yahweh has created. So you're not going to have the problems with cancer and all sorts of other diseases that we're getting from our modern way of life. That's all going to be gone. And, of course, there's going to be a partial lifting of the curse. Won't be so many weeds and stuff in the garden to have to worry about. And you're going to have differences in the way that the human body operates. You're going to live for hundreds of years. Sin, obviously, will still be there, but disease won't be quite the same. Death will still be there, but it's greatly curtailed. And if you are living for hundreds of years, you might begin to suspect that you're an immortal. Yeah, you're an immortal. You're like those people that are in charge over you. So shedding of blood is required. Because you see, it's a little bit like Adam and Eve in the garden. Men living for hundreds of years without sickness and disease may lose sight of their mortality. Like Adam and Eve in the garden, they will need to see the death of an animal to know what mortality really means. Just get an image in your mind of what happened back there in the garden, brothers and sisters. When the angel took the lamb and cut its throat, it was the first time that Adam and Eve had seen death. They hadn't seen death. So when God said, in the day that thou eatest thereof, dying, thou shalt surely die, it meant nothing to them. What's this dying you're talking about? They had never seen death until the lamb was slain. Then they watched the blood pour out of its throat. And as that lamb, you know, you've seen it. As that lamb died, is that what you mean? See, they now knew what it was. The animal's still. It's dead. Is that what you mean by death? And so, brothers and sisters, people that have lived for hundreds of years, who have very few funerals to go to, they won't know what death is really, many of them. They'll know when they come to offer sacrifice what death is. That's the lesson that Adam and Eve had to learn. Hence, the sacrificial arrangements in the temple are set up to ensure that shed blood is everywhere evident as a graphic reminder of every mortal man's need for redemption. And that's why they have to walk about Zion and to go round about her, as Psalm 48 says. So let's just read what Brother Sully says about this. Page 81 of the Temple of Ezekiel's prophecy, he says, "Now we have seen that all who enter the temple must leave it on the opposite side." I'll come back and refer to that in a minute again. "Those entering on the north, passing out at the south, and vice versa. From considerations hereafter mentioned, all worshippers reach the temple from the south. And since they cannot pass the sanctuary on the eastern side," remember, that's where you've got the closed doors on the eastern side. That's where you've got the waters of swimming of the two rivers. So you can't cross there anyway. Can't go that way. "All must of necessity pass the burning refuse on the western side," because there is going to be a dump out there, "either in going to the temple or in returning therefrom. Hence, when the judgments of the Lord are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness." Isaiah 26, verse 9. Now, I want to illustrate that by looking at this little map here. We're looking down on the temple, you can see. Do you notice that this line, which is the northern boundary of the portion of the Levites, this is the portion of the saints up here, the holy portion. Notice that this line actually passes through the temple above the inner road of celae or halls. Yeah, because it's actually in their territory, because they are the ministers of this place. See, they're the ones who are going to minister in the house. So the bottom portion of the temple actually in the Levites portion. It's a remarkable fact, which you'll find if you do your own study of Ezekiel's temple. So you've got a bit of a picture of that. You can't access the temple from over on that eastern side because you've got waters of swimming. The gates are shut. So follow me. We're going to follow some worshippers here. And this is the law that those worshippers have to observe. In Ezekiel 46, verse 9, it says, "This is the law of the house. He that entereth in by the way of the north gate to worship shall go out by the way of the south gate. And he that entereth by the way of the south gate shall go forth by the way of the north gate. He shall not return by the way of the gate whereby he came in, but shall go forth over against it. Walk about Zion. Mark ye well her bulwarks." You know, the psalm talks about that. That's going to be fulfilled, because you can't just go in, you know, like tourists take a few shots. Oh, this is a lovely place, and get back on the bus. All right, you can't do that. You come in the north, you go out the south. You come in the south, you go out the north. You've got to walk a mile at least to get out. You're walking about Zion. So that's going to be fulfilled. So let's follow one of these worshippers, shall we? They come up from Yahweh Shema in the south, and they're going to find something here because there's a dump. Now, we'll be in a situation that's not right up against a wall like it was in ancient Jerusalem, because there will be a lot of odours that come out of that place. But they're going to find bodies out there. And we're going to see this from Isaiah 66. They're going to find bodies out there of people who came to this house with an evil heart. You do not come to this place with an evil heart, because you're not going home. And Brother Sully actually paints a terrific picture of this in his book, about the time when the sacrifices are to be accepted at 3 p.m. in the afternoon by fire from heaven, and nothing happens. Because there's someone there that's put a sacrifice on the altar, but they've done it with a deceptive and evil heart. They're not genuine. They're not sincere. They've come here because they're probably compelled to. You know, mum and dad said, I've got to come. And they're not going home. They will be killed, just like Ananias and Sapphira were, dropped dead on the spot. And the Levites will pick them up and take them out and put them on the dump. And they'll be rotting on the dump. And the fire will burn continually on that dump. That's what these people are going to see, because they've got to pass by. Watch them. Someone's coming up here. Someone's coming up. Here he comes. He's got to go past the dump. He's coming to make sacrifice. He goes into the house. He's got his sacrifice made. He shares a fellowship. He does what he has to do. And he goes back down to Yahweh Shema. You've got someone else coming up. This may be the next day, for example. He's made sacrifice. So he comes in the south gate. He's got to go out the north gate. He can't go around the east side. He's got to go around this way. Right? He comes past the dump. You've got someone who's coming from the east, for example. They pass by the mausoleum to go. And they're going to come into the temple. They do their bit, all right? But they've got to go home. They can't go around the east. They've got to come this way. So what's the common denominator for all three? They all pass by the dump. Come with me. I want you all to come with me to Isaiah 66. Isaiah chapter 66. And I'm going to read this from verse 22. Isaiah 66, verse 22. For as the new heavens and the new earth, we spoke about that yesterday, didn't we? Isaiah 65, remember that? The new heavens and the new earth, new government, new populace. For as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, saith Yahweh, so shall your seed and your name remain. He's talking about Israel, who are the subject of the previous verses. And, look at verse 23. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Yahweh. This is Zechariah 14:16. The nations who survive are coming up year by year. That doesn't mean every person of every nation. It means representatives of the nations. You might go up once or twice in a lifetime of hundreds of years. So they're going to come up regularly. They're going to be, this house can hold 500,000 people. You can actually sit 500,000 people in here on a day. So there's going to be a lot of people coming up. It says in verse 24, and they shall go forth to look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. Now, Christ quotes this, doesn't he? Your margin will tell you that if you go to Mark chapter 9 and verse 44, Christ quotes this passage. Why? Well, he's not talking about immortal maggots, is he? When he says their worm shall not die. You're not talking about immortal maggots. Nor is he talking about a fire that never goes out. He's talking about the fact that there's always going to be a supply of bodies for fire and maggots to consume for 1,000 years. Now, some people think this is a reference to Gog. Well, if you just read Ezekiel chapter 39, you will know that within 7 months of the destruction of the Gogian host, not one single bone will be above ground. They will bury Gog and all his multitude, it says. And if they find a bone in the field, they'll put a sign by it, bury it out of sight. There'll be a mausoleum, a building, but not a single bone. It's not about Gog. And by the way, that's 40 years ago. The temple's here, all right? The temple's here. 40 years ago, Gog was destroyed. This is about the whole 1,000 years of the kingdom age. A perpetual supply of dead bodies. I guess you can probably see why that sister said, you're destroying my vision of the kingdom. Yeah, it's reality. Because we're dealing with human nature. And if you know what your human nature's like, I know what mine's like. You can put it in the very best environment you like, as Isaiah 26 says, and it will not conform if there's not the willingness to conform. It's rebellious against the things of God. There's got to be willingness and a desire. Got to be faith. Well, not everybody's going to have faith in the kingdom, and not everybody has faith today. That's the reality of it. That's what the scripture says. So here we've got perpetual bodies laid in this place rotting, eaten by maggots, burning fire that never goes out. What do you think that's for, brothers and sisters? Well, I'll tell you, I've tried to put myself there as a mortal. I've tried to walk past this dump. 1, 4, 3. What's that telling me? Get your act together, brother. Do something about your life. You've got a weakness, deal with it. Don't play around with this God. He's gracious and merciful and long-suffering, but he will not accept rebellion. He will not accept people with a vacant head. Get your act together, brother. That's what I say to myself. And I don't think that's a bad exhortation. That's what it's there for. So shall we get more positive here? Let's have a look at what happens when you arrive as a mortal at the northern gates where sacrifices are made. I want you to follow, because there's 2 ways of dealing with this, as you're going to see. We can do it in this form. They cross the waters. They arrive at the gate with their sacrifice. They're leading along an animal, and they come up here to the gate, and there's a Levite waiting for them there. And that Levite takes the animal from them and he deals with it. You've got here, you see these slaying blocks. There are 4 of them, 2 on this side and 2 on that side. And the sacrifice is then taken into the gate. There's a 50 cubit gate or entrance way into this building. And then, of course, there's a preparation of that sacrifice for parts of it to go to the altar and parts of it to go elsewhere, as we shall see. So you get a little bit of a feel. They're going to climb up those 7 steps, those covenant steps. Here we're looking down on the gate, by the way. So there's the north up there. You can see the 4 slaying blocks up there. There they are, the slaying blocks. Then you've got the 7 covenant steps to go to this house. You cross through into the porch area, and on either side there are tables for preparing the sacrifices. Those who are coming out from the other way have come in the south. They've got to go out the north. They can't miss this because they've got to pass by on the left-hand side as well. As they go out, they see the sacrifices being prepared for others. So you can't miss it. And when you sacrifice an animal and you carry it up the steps and across 50 cubits, there's a little bit of blood being dropped on the floor. It doesn't matter where you look. There's blood. Why? For the reasons we've been talking about. To remind you that you are mortal. You need redemption. Let's look at it another way. This is another way of describing. What we have here are the 2 rows of cella. You've got the outer court in the middle there. Let's have a look at it again. The Levites meet the worshippers up there. They arrive at the gate, met by the Levite. The Levite is the red. The worshipper is in the blue on these arrows. So they join, they come together, and there those tables are used. You can see there. Those tables are used for the preparation of the sacrifices. Now you'll notice there's another red arrow up here. There's tables on the other side in the row of buildings. That's because you see portions of the sacrifices are going to go to the altar. And the Levites will take them across to this area, prepare the fat and the blood and the things that are going to the altar, and then they'll change their garments. They're not going to be able to carry those sacrifices to the inner circular temple without changing their garment. Why are they going to change their garments? Well, they just killed an animal. They got blood all over them. So they change their garments before they take that animal up to the immortal priests who will accept it at their hands at the inner gates of the circular house. Got a bit of a picture of that? Right, well, what happens then, do you think? Because the Levites have taken the sacrifices. You see the arrow going off to the right there? They're going to take off portions of the sacrifices to the corner towers, which are the preparation areas. This is the kitchens, you might say, of the temple, because these worshippers are going to sit down for a fellowship meal. And there may well be 500,000 of them at that sitting. So there's a lot of food to be provided. So a portion of the sacrifices will be used for that purpose. And then, of course, you've got the worshipper. They go up into there's 3 levels in the halls. They go and they find a place to sit down up there that they might share a meal. Just try and get the imagery in your mind, because it's going to be real one day. This is just a picture. It is going to be real one day. And you and I are going to stand in these courts, particularly on the east side, as you saw yesterday, on the east side, more about that later on. And we're going to be there with our Lord Jesus Christ and a multitude of our brothers and sisters from all ages. What a time that will be. I want to take you now to the altar. Ezekiel 40, verse 47 says this. So he measured the court 100 cubits long. Now, a cubit can be 18 inches, or if you put a handbreadth to it, 20 odd inches. Okay? Work that out in your head. 100 cubits, a cubit being 18 inches at least. What do we go? 150 feet? Is my maths okay? 150 feet. How long is this hall? Is it 150 feet? I wouldn't have thought so. This is a pretty big altar, isn't it? Because there's going to be millions of sacrifices on it. Hundreds of thousands of sacrifices on it every day to be consumed by fire at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. There's a very important detail here. And that detail is that word you can see in the yellow up there, which is the Hebrew word pani. And pani means the face or in the presence of. We use a term, don't we, in our modern world? Someone's in your face. Yeah, well, it's about that, being in the face, in the presence of. What that means is that this altar is in the presence of the entire house, which tells you something. It's in the centre of the house. Yes, because it's on the top of Mount Zion, which is the centre of the house, right? Very important detail. Not only is the altar larger, by the way, than the proportions of some small temple theories. That's how ridiculous they are. So here we've got the altar in the presence of the house. And when the time comes for the sacrifices to be accepted, this is an artist's impression of what it's going to be like. Fire from heaven. You can see why there has to be that cloud to protect the mortals from the brilliance of what's going to happen and the glory that's revealed in the most holy place. Now, it happened in the days of Solomon, didn't it? You can read over here. Now, when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And the glory of Yahweh filled the house. It's going to happen all over again in the kingdom age every day. Every day there's sacrifices made. It's going to happen for 1,000 years. So, brothers and sisters, I want to conclude, hopefully, on what might be a challenging but also a positive note. In Isaiah 33, verse 14, we read this. It's couched with two questions. Who among us shall dwell with a devouring fire? Well, I'll tell you who will. Immortal priests who are there to take the sacrifices to the top of Mount Zion and place them on the altar. When that fire comes down from heaven, they will stand there like Daniel's three friends in the furnace of Nebuchadnezzar. There'll be no smoke on their clothing. They will not be touched by the fire. They will survive the devouring fire. Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings, age-lasting burnings? Yeah, for the 1,000 years. Yeah, same people. The ones who are not touched by the fire of divine judgment, like those who burn on the refuse dump outside the Western Wall. It's a challenge, isn't it? It's also an encouragement, because the promise is this: him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. I don't know about you. I can't wait for that day.